Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Unlike the colonies of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, which relied on a convict labour force and where the government's penal system precluded the early development of free institutions, South Australia from its inception was a private enterprise capitalist society employing wage labour. The founders of the province, members of the British middle class, wanted it to be an extension of the conditions they considered ideal in the old country. They were social reformers imbued with notions of liberalism, free trade, philanthropy, religious freedom and freedom from government interference. But these aspirations arose from and were subject to the essential economic system they supported and proposed for the colonies. That is, to relations of production as outlined by E.G. Wakefield, which would unite capitalist landowners and hired labour. The South Australian historian William Harkis wrote in 1876, "All new colonies are, as a matter of course, dependent for their prosperity on a plentiful supply of labour. However fruitful the land and rich in resources, it is nothing without labour." The Wakefield system of colonising was to combine capital and labour, the capitalist purchasing the land and the money paid for it being devoted to the introduction of men to work it. And when the first 6 ships arrived in South Australia in 1836, the British Colonial Office recorded that their passengers comprised 26 males and 10 females of the superior class and 152 males and 37 females of the labouring class. The class society so founded immediately gave rise to class conflict, to workers' struggles and organisations. The freedom of the planners applied in only partial degree to the labourers, who, unable easily to acquire land, had to work for the landowners and other employers. The first strike occurred in 1837 among the survey labourers employed by Colonel Light. The initial shortage of labour meant that skilled building tradesmen could earn 12 shillings to 15 shillings per day and labourers 7 shillings to 8 shillings, while the survey labourers had signed an agreement in England to work for 12 shillings per week and a scale of rations equal to that allowed in the British Navy, but which was often in short supply. Newly arriving immigrants called them the 2 shillings a day slaves, and Colonel Light wrote, "Their complaints had much truth. They were sometimes many days with hardly anything but biscuit, sometimes not that." In June 1838, mechanics in Adelaide held a general meeting to consider the necessity of instituting a trade society. In July 1839, tailors formed a trade society and advised master tailors that they could obtain men by applying to Mr. Calton. 2 months afterwards, carpenters employed by Messrs. East and Breeze went on strike for an extra 1 shilling a day and quickly won the increase, which took their wages to between 11 shillings and 14 shillings per day. At the Australian Arms in November 1839, members of the South Australian Builders Trade Union Society gave a dinner to their retiring secretary, Mr. Hanson. A variety of toasts were drunk by the 114 members present, and Mr. Wakeham occupied the chair. In the following year, Thomas & Co. printed the rules of this body. In the form of a mutual benefit society, it insured members against the loss of property, probably tools of trade, by fire and robbery, and for the proper interment of the dead. The Depression of 1840-42 taught the workers many early lessons. They bore the brunt of hardships arising from the inconsistent economy by lower wages, loss of savings and unemployment. This despite the promises given them that the government would guarantee work at reduced wages if no work for private individuals offered. Workers unemployed through no fault of their own were called improvident idlers, the colonial equivalent of the modern-day dole grudgers. Representatives of the superior class, such as John Morfitt, Major O'Halloran, Duncan McFarlane and William Giles, occupied positions of power in the state apparatus as the chief magistrates and recommended reduction of government relief payments to unemployed workers and their dependents. The workers protested at the attempt to reduce the price of labour of the producers of all wealth. So Governor Grey and the press found intolerable their meetings, demonstrations, memorials and resolutions. The Southern Australian depicted illegal combinations among the working class and alleged attempts which have recently been made to support in idleness a few ill-disposed persons among the working classes who had conspired together to keep up wages. It urged the government to legislate a Masters and Servants Act. When introduced in the legislature in September 1841, this provided for forfeiture of wages due and 60 days in prison if a worker broke a written or verbal contract of employment. A master defaulting, on the other hand, could be fined an amount not exceeding £20. Arising from this depression, the workers formed a Working Men's Association to provide for the present and prevent the future distress of the labouring classes of South Australia, and to arrange such intellectual enjoyment as the circumstances of the times require. This body probably derived its name from the London Working Men's Association, the first political labour organisation. Formed by William Lovett and his friends in 1836, in the following year it launched that crusade of the English working class, the People's Charter. Working Men's Association became the name of other unions of workers subsequently in South Australia, notably the Port Adelaide Wharf Labourers. In an economy mainly rural and dependent on the vagaries of the annual rainfall or the state of the copper market, recessions were not infrequent. In addition, as capital accumulated, there also developed the relative surplus of labour endemic in the old country. The depressions in surplus labour gave employers the opportunity to reduce wages, and the workers in reply formed combinations to protect their standard of living. With discovery of copper at Kapunda and Burra in the 1840s, the working class grew more rapidly. To farm labourers and town craftsmen were now added the Cornish and German miners, the Welsh smeltermen, and the hundreds of other labourers engaged as bullock drivers transporting ore from the mines to the port, or as timber cutters for mine props and boiler fires. In 1847, Captain Charles Bagot of the Kapunda mine, as one of the colony's largest employers, sponsored a bill in the Legislative Council to amend the Masters and Servants Act. This would require, in all cases, a written contract of employment. Breach of contract by any misdemeanour of a workman could entail 3 months in prison or forfeiture of wages due, or both. This provision applied to domestic servants, most of whom were women. An employer failing to pay wages, on the other hand, could be imprisoned for a few days until discharged under the Insolvency Act. The magistrates to hear these cases were themselves employers of labour, and appeal was from the magistrates to the magistrates. The bill proposed the supply of indentured labour with 5-year contracts for Chinese, Germans and other possible sources of cheap labour. Bagot said the captains of vessels had urged upon the colony the necessity of the introduction of Chinese. Meetings of protest, which carried resolutions and signed memorials, were the responses of workers at Hindmarsh and Bowden, of miners at the Miners' Arms Glen Osmond, and of German workers at the Hamburg Hotel Adelaide. The latter especially criticised agreements made in ignorance by foreign-born workers, which bound them to lower rates of pay than English fellow labourers for a term of years. The meeting condemned abuses by tyrannical masters on migrant ships, unsatisfactory shelter for newly arrived immigrants, and payment by the truck system. The protest movement and a divided council resulted in the legislation being abandoned. In September the following year, the Southern Australian published the sensational headline, "Revolution at the Burra Mine." The miners had gone on strike following reductions in contract rates and a dispute about the quality of the ore they produced. Yet the owners of the monster mine in the previous 15 months had received dividends totalling 1,000% on their capital. This dispute also set precedent for the workers of the colony and the 300 miners directly concerned. The degree of wealth of the employers matched a ruthless and autocratic attitude to their workers in efforts to extract the maximum profit. The employers regarded the withholding of labour in strike action as illegal. They commanded and used the full power of the state forces in the form of police and courts in attempts to break the strike. Combinations of workers were banned or barely recognised, and that then only if they were in Austria. Freedom of the press and civil liberties accounted for little when the owners' interests were threatened, and the register was banned from borough for supporting the strikers. The mine owners encouraged the myth, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that employers and workers had identical interests. The workers, demanding solidarity, compelled a recalcitrant few to join the strike. The owners, on the other hand, gave such renegades every encouragement and protection. Time does not permit a full account of the many workers' economic struggles before Federation. They included the movement for the 8-hour day, which commenced at Port Adelaide in 1854, 2 years before it was achieved by building workers at Sydney and Melbourne. The 8-hour day became firmly established by some workers in 1873, but for years afterwards the unions had to defend it against employers' incursions while attempting to extend it to other sections of workers and making it permanent by statute. Another campaign commencing in 1854 was that for the early closing of shops. After successes and failures, early closing had been substantially achieved by 1889. Waterside workers and seamen became more active after the formation of unions in 1872, and shearers combined in the following year. These three groups, as well as ship's officers, were involved in disputes for the right of workers to combine in unions for their mutual protection in 1887, a forerunner to the maritime strike of 1890. At Wallaroo and Moonta, copper miners had strikes in 1864, 1874, 1888 and 1891. In 1879, all metal trades workers at Gawler stopped when James Martin and Company attempted to extend the working day to 9 hours. And a lockout of workers at Fulton's foundry occurred in 1888 over the same issue. In that year, printing workers at the offices of the Register struck for the right to organise in a union. In early 1890, strikes by 10 different sections of workers preceded the maritime strike. These were over issues including defence of wages, the 8-hour day, protection of skills and aversion to cheap labour. Colonial women supported their menfolk in the strikes of the miners at Moonta, and as more women entered the workforce, they campaigned against sweating in the clothing industry. In 1888, the Women's Suffrage League was established, and the following year, the Working Women's Trade Union was formed. The workers from early times showed interest in political matters affecting colonial society. They resisted the Wakefield scheme, which by charging a sufficient price for land prevented wage earners from easily acquiring. Instead of becoming independent producers, they necessarily had to work for others. The use of the land fund to import migrant labour led to a periodic surplus of wage workers and consequent unemployment and destitution. They demanded instead government expenditure on public works. The sale of land at a fixed price invited speculation and ownership by absentees, placing it further out of reach of small farmers. Most property owners commended the Wakefield scheme as a supplier of labour, and most official historians have praised it as an aid to colonisation. But it was at the expense of the workers, and it had other critics. Wakefield himself quite clearly stated the scheme's purpose when he wrote, "I then turned my mind to plans of immigration with a view at once to increase the number of working hands and diminish the wages of labour." Charles Mann, the colony's first Advocate General, also had an understanding of the scheme's purpose. The money subscribed for land is neither a price, a tax, or a monstrous charge for land, but on the contrary, it is a wise and provident payment for the transmission to the settlement of that labour power without which it would be vain to attempt the application of capital at all. It augments instead of diminishing the power of the capital. The workers condemned the scheme. In 1841, the unemployed claimed they had been lured from their native land by the most flattering inducement. In 1854, building workers on strike against a wage cut criticised employers for their continual demand for cheap labour and the perversion of the land fund for that purpose. In 1859, working men and section farmers revived the former political association, which had as its objective the halting of immigration under the Wakefield scheme. It soon had 12 branches in Adelaide, suburbs and country towns, and more than 1,000 members. At a meeting of the association in early 1860, Mr. Petheridge stated, "It was the great mining shareholders and flockholders who were continually crying more labour, more labour. But the interpretation of the cry was lower wages, lower wages. An association meeting at Gawler declared that the time has arrived when it was desirable that the Wakefield system of immigration should finally cease. The chairman, a wheelwright named Gregory, said experience of the colony had led him to the conclusion that its great men had an interest in keeping down the working men. The time was when an industrious working man could get his section of land for £80. But now the original system was entirely changed and no land could be got but through the land jobbers. By 1886, the labour organisation, with labour organisations soundly based, the Intercolonial Trades Union Congress convened in Adelaide. There, a South Australian delegate of the Saddlers Union, T. Keane, in retrospect summed up the attitude of the colony's workers to the Wakefield system. Regulations of an absolute slave character were adopted to prevent industrious and saving mechanics or other workmen from becoming proprietors of land. The price was raised in order to raise that for which 12 6 an acre had been given, on condition that the purchase money was devoted to sending out labourers to work for hire, which if they could not get land, they would of necessity have to do. The labourer was in fact, though not in name, the slave of the landowner. At each period of depression, with little demand for labour and with unemployment, the workers agitated against government-assisted or free immigration and against cheap labour in the form of Ceylonese or Chinese workers. This was so in 1859-60, 1865-70 and in 1883. In more favourable times, as in 1872-73, they also condemned assisted immigration because employers, assured of a plentiful supply of labour, felt no obligation to make working conditions attractive by improving standards. Nevertheless, in the early period, some labourers, by hard work and a modicum of luck, could save sufficient to buy an 88-acre section. South Australian conditions particularly favoured agriculture, and among labourers emigrating there existed a great land hunger. Many hoped to become farmers, either by owning land or by working as tenant farmers. In 1847, the Register reported, "It will appear that the class of small farmers is increasing rapidly. In the dry season they are employed in carting ore from the mines to the port, for which they are well paid. And when the rain sets in and this work is suspended, it is time for ploughing and sowing. With their gains in carting ore, many have been enabled to purchase or rent land and have commenced farming on their own account." In South Australia, the influence of small farmers in politics and social life overshadowed and delayed working class consciousness. Two other retarding factors were the rush to the Victorian gold diggings in the 1850s, which denuded the colony of many thousands of its working population, and the systems of contract work as carters, miners, and in other occupations. These systems of payment by result often gave workers the impression that they were self-employed. Many immigrants in the early days followed the evolutionary pattern of farm labourers, carters, copper miners, diggers at the Victorian goldfields, and on their return, landowners growing wheat and grazing sheep and cattle. Of the small farmers, a writer stated in 1875, "The yeomanry who have found a home in South Australia and who are at once tillers of the soil and employers of labour are more than any one class the real bone and sinew of the colony." This situation changed as the 80-acre sections became uneconomic and large land holdings with machinery were required for extensive farming, and as the colony slowly acquired more industry, making workers less dependent on farm work. The influence of the small farmers pervaded the theories of land reform, from taxation of land to its nationalisation, and in particular the theory of single tax, which had such a large effect on the labour movement. The predominance of the rural base for many years tended to cause a lag in the labour movement in South Australia compared with some other states. Official history generally credits members of the superior class with the democratic reforms which led to the advanced constitution and responsible government in 1856. But the reforms were achieved not so much by them as in spite of them. All sections of colonial thought subscribed to the maintenance of religious liberty and to the prospect of self-government when the population reached 50,000. But while agitation for earlier self-government achieved some concessions from the imperial government, These ensured that the property owners would have the real power in the colonial legislature. In 1843, Governor Grey appointed 4 non-official members to the Legislative Council: John Morfitt, Major O'Halloran, C.F. Dashwood and T. Williams, all men of substantial property. The workers in 1847, while opposing amendments to the Masters and Servants Act, complained of restraints on one class without representation in the Legislative Council, and warned that it would lead to associations of workers for their mutual protection and redress. The superior class, with the increased acquisition of property and assured by the governors of political power in the Legislative Council, became more conservative. The leadership of the reform movement passed to a coalition of town artisans and tradesmen, workers and small farmers, who were able to influence a few Liberals in the legislature. Later on, the Labour movement became the main reforming influence. The coalition, representing the majority of the people, strongly contested Morfitt's proposal in 1849 for a constitution to include an upper house of members nominated by the governor and given hereditary titles. The same year, hundreds of workers and farmers clashed with the government, which had imposed taxes on land and on wheeled vehicles. A great confederated anti-dray and land tax league was formed with a central slogan, "No taxation without representation." It urged carters and farmers not to pay the taxes, gave support to those prosecuted for non-payment, and launched a memorial of opposition to present to Governor Young. This movement also succeeded and the taxes were withdrawn. In 1850, with the colony's constitution soon to be granted, tradesmen and artisans at Hindmarsh formed an elective franchise association, and at Adelaide a complete suffrage league. The two bodies amalgamated to form the South Australian Political Association. One spokesman, Morris, said, "It was well known to all thinking men that if the working class was supine at this juncture, they would allow a system to be established that their descendants would groan under." Another speaker, McMahon, said, "The basis of legislation was hitherto based on capital. But what originated capital? That which created a thing was equally to be considered with the thing it created. Labour was the creator of capital." He predicted, "As yet there was comparative equality here, but every year would, if their rights were not secured, go to increase the distinction of classes. The rich would become more rich and exacting, the poor more powerless and dependent." Other speakers referred to the Chartists in Britain, and the association adopted the entire Chartist program: universal male suffrage, equal electoral districts, vote by ballot, annual parliament, no property qualifications for members, and payment of members. In addition, it specifically opposed nominated members and state endowment of religion. The Chartist demands were central to the struggle for a democratic constitution. Agitation for this failed to influence the Legislative Council for the election of 1851. The property voting assured the return of landowners, pastoralists, merchants and mine owners, and property was further consolidated in power. Rather than retard the movement for political reform with the absence of so many workers at the diggings, the democratic ferment there stimulated the movement in South Australia. In 1853, the Legislative Council, taking the advice of the Imperial Government, proposed an upper house of nominated members. A petition of opposition was signed by 15,000 in 3 days. The following year, the Legislative Council, responding to the people's movement, declared against a nominated upper house. The Imperial Government, which had insisted on a nominated upper house in 1853, in 1855, following the Eureka event and the democratic agitation in all colonies, asked the South Australian Government to reconsider the construction of the future Legislative Council. According to B.T. Finnis, the opposition had succeeded in defeating the Parliament Bill through their memorial to the imperial authorities. The final outcome was South Australia's advanced constitution, which included most of the Chartist demands. But this was offset by the power of property in the Legislative Council, whose members were elected by a property vote. And workers would be excluded from Parliament because members would not be paid. The Imperial Government remained the arbiter of any interpretations of the Constitution. Furthermore, the ownership of land by large numbers assured a degree of conservative stability in defence of property. The Labour movement persisted in its campaigns against government-assisted immigration and to complete the demands of the Charter for equal political rights and the payment of members. The South Australian Political Association of 1859 included these points in its program. John Clark, its president, advocated taxation of absentee landholders and alteration of the land system to allow men to get a section without having to compete with a land agent and have it on such terms as they first got the implements to work the ground with. Thus, the purchase of land on credit, first proposed by the workers' movement, preceded the Strangways Act by a decade. The association became a firm advocate of land reform and later of protection for the colony's manufacturers. The association still operated in the 1870s, drawing up a program of workers' demands for each election. In 1887, following the agitation for payment of members, the Playford government approved this, thus paving the way for working class representation in Parliament and the formation of the United Labour Party for that purpose. As well as the early trade unions, the workers formed other associations to look after their material, social and cultural interests. Such were the Friendly Societies and the Building Societies, for the mutual self-help of small tradesmen, artisans and workers. The former enabled members to insure against sickness, unemployment and funeral expenses. The latter gave them some possibility of owning their own homes. One order of the Oddfellows commenced in 1844. It would be followed soon afterwards by the Druids and the Foresters. Similar functions were performed by the Rechabites and the Templars, connected with the temperance movement. These societies helped to promote workers' self-discipline, giving training in outlook and organisation to future members of the labour movement. This opinion was voiced by McMahon at a meeting of the Complete Suffrage League in support of workers' representation in the legislature. They were generally members of Oddfellows' lodges and building societies, and the habits of thought and calculation this induced fitted them for the consideration of political questions better than accident of birth or the possession of property. Two other sets of ideas having their roots in Britain influenced the colonial workers: the Methodist religion and the temperance movement. In England, Methodism had spread as an adjunct of the Industrial Revolution with the assistance of local preachers. A grassroots democracy flourished in its societies and chapels, officered by tradesmen and working people. This democracy conflicted with Wesleyan autocracy and the conference of nominated clergy, and a number of sects broke away from the main body. The Bible Christians had strong associations with unions of farm labourers, while primitive Methodism became a virtual labour religion in the north of England, and its members went on to become leaders of trade unions and charters. In Cornwall, Wesleyan Methodism, the conservative side of this religion, had a stronghold. The miners had other conservative features, such as the contract system of tribute and cut work, which tended to delay the development of class consciousness and solidarity. It was not until 1857 that the first strike occurred among the miners of Cornwall, that is, 10 years after the strike at Burra. They knew practically nothing about trade unions, while radical politics and Chartism remained weak. Many South Australians followed Methodism as one of the nonconformist religions, whose numbers before long rivalled those of the Church of England. The Cornish miners brought their religion with them and spread it from Kapunda and Burra to Kanmantu, Callington, Moonta and Wallaroo. The conservatism of the Cornish miners undoubtedly affected those in South Australia, where it took many years for trade unionism to be firmly established among them. Generally, Methodism, closely linked to the temperance movement, tended to promote what has been popularly termed as wowserism. Many social reformers concentrated on the temperance movement, ignoring or failing to understand the real causes of squalor as arising from the industrial system, and instead blamed the workers. A temperance movement commenced in 1838, and a total abstinence society was formed in 1840. Then followed the Band of Hope and many branches of the Rechabites. By 1865, the Rechabites could claim 49 tents in Adelaide, suburbs and country towns, while the Templars had 87 lodges. Like the other friendly societies, they were a training ground for labour activists. David Charleston and Robert Guthrie, two prominent unionists and early labour members, were Rechabites. The Reverend Hugh Gilmore, a workers' leader in the 90s, was a primitive Methodist. Richard Hooper from Wallaroo, an early Labour parliamentarian, was a primitive Methodist, as were future Labour premiers John Verron and Bob Richards, both of whom were lay preachers. They were also prominent Rechabites. The first Labour premier, Tom Price, was a Wesleyan lay preacher and a Rechabite. After trade unionism finally became established among the Cornish miners in 1872, they were prominent in the industrial and political labour movement. Expansion of industry in the 1860s created a demand for more workers, skilled and unskilled, in railways, mines, manufacturing and shipping, and sporadic industrial actions were accompanied by moves to strengthen organisation. In the 70s, the pace of growth quickened and trade unions became firmly established. In 1873, a United Tradesmen's Society campaigned for the 8-hour day. In 1877, 13 unions affiliated to it formed the Labour League of South Australia. The Labour League had its own newspaper for a brief period, the Labour Advocate. Among the League's aims was, by a prudent exercise of their franchise, to secure by legislative enactment what is now only obtained by combination. In 1880, the Typographers' Society formed a National Liberal Reform League to organise the workers into a powerful political association. Its chairman was Andrew Kirkpatrick, and it lasted for a year or two. The Intercolonial Trade Union Congresses commenced in 1879, and subsequent attendances of South Australian unionists convinced them of the need for improved forms of organisation in the colony. By 1882, the 2,000 workers taking part in the annual 8 hours day march claimed that they were the bone and sinew of the colony. In September that year, Kirkpatrick addressed a meeting of the Labour League in support of the proposal to form a Trades and Labour Council. This was formed in January 1884 for the purpose of uniting more closely the various trade societies and for discussing unitedly any question affecting the welfare of any society, and also for the purpose of exerting more political influence in the colony. The colonial labour movement had become more consolidated by the early 1880s. In 1885, the Trades and Labour Council formed a parliamentary committee for the consideration of political matters. These advances by the labour movement created a reaction among employers. In 1886, they formed an employers' union, and John Darling Jr., one of its sponsors, said it was desirable that the union be formed with some degree of strength, carried on with some spirit, and with employers as unanimous as those on the other side. The same year, F.J. Morris, Secretary of the Port Adelaide Seamen's Union, acted as President of the 4th Union Congress held in Adelaide and said, "I think there are signs of a mighty struggle in the near future between capital and labour, a struggle that will test all our powers of endurance, that will take all our force to resist." The Congress showed that the South Australian Trades and Labour Council had 24 affiliated societies, and in addition there were organisations of miners and tradesmen on York Peninsula and other centres, shearers, teachers and shop assistants. Following the Congress, unions at Port Adelaide formed a Maritime Labour Council. Meanwhile, the vast mineral wealth of the Barrier Ranges gave a stimulus to South Australia's ailing economy. The mines at Broken Hill found in Port Pirie their most convenient port. The smelters established there became the colony's largest industry. South Australian merchants and manufacturers gained substantial markets at the Barrier, and its capitalists a rewarding field of investment. Capitalism by the end of the 80s had been strengthened with growth of monopoly trends in pastoralism, mining, shipping, banking and commerce. On the other hand, the labour movement had grown and consolidated. It only needed the conditions of overall economic recession to create the class confrontations of 1887 and 1890. Substantially defeated in the maritime strike, the unions could still show the benefits in strengthened organisation. More than 70 unions or branches contributed to the strike fund, totalling £9,662. Thereafter, the class divisions in society were more pronounced, and a degree of socialist understanding had developed in the labour movement. Signs of working class socialist theory had appeared by the mid-80s. In 1885, the Kapunda Herald favourably reviewed a pamphlet it had received from the International Working Men's Association, which propagated the theories of Karl Marx. At the Trade Union Congress in Adelaide in the following year, Morris called for uniting the toilers of all nations into one universal brotherhood, and instead of the worker striving all his day to support some idle drones in luxury, the results of his toil may be his own. In 1887, A. Raymond in Adelaide wrote his Rights of Labour and How to Obtain Them, which espoused the theories of single tax. This was reprinted in pamphlet form by the newspaper Our Commonwealth, edited by the remarkable Ignatius Singer. It combined a kind of Christian socialism and land reform, becoming in 1888 the organ of the Trades and Labour Council. Arriving in the colony in 1889, the Reverend Hugh Gilmore, an advocate of both these theories, spoke in support of the London dock strike. In the dock labourers' strike, he said, they heard the first great move of the disinherited English. The wealth of Britain had increased in this century to an almost fabulous extent. The country was the paradise of the rich and the hell of the poor. He blamed the system of society and not men. During the maritime strike, he said, the trouble existing now was because a few held in their hands the instruments of production, and the many employed were only allowed to use those instruments now and then on condition of receiving what the holders of the instrument of production were willing to allow. George Buttery, Trades and Labour Council during the maritime strike, had been an associate of Marx in the International Workingmen's Association, and according to one early socialist, had a great influence in forming the principles of the colony's industrial and political labour movement. After the conclusion of the strike, David Charleston spoke on new unionism at the Democratic Club. The late struggle has been full of useful and beneficial object lessons, he said, showing most unmistakably our need for broad liberal unionism and control of production. Unionism has a glorious work to achieve, namely, the complete emancipation of labour, the securing to it of the full results of its toil. The producers of wealth shall possess the means of controlling wealth. In January 1891, 50 unions presented £116 to Buttery and Trades and Labour Council Secretary J.A. Macpherson in appreciation of their leadership during the strike. When the United Labour Party was formed in the same month, Buttery occupied the chair and Macpherson became its first secretary. While socialist ideas had been strengthened during the strike, other theories proved more influential. Arbitration would resolve the class struggle around the conference table. Village settlements combining Christian socialism and single tax, and the new Australia expedition to Paraguay were ventures into utopia. The United Labour Party would legislate for the workers in Parliament. All showed lack of understanding of the workings of capitalism, especially the role of the state and rejection of socialist theory. The United Labour Party aimed to represent the immediate wants and aspirations of the workers by direct labour candidates, that is, eligible trade unionists who could be recalled. For the Legislative Council elections of May 1891, its three candidates, Charleston, Guthrie and Kirkpatrick, were successful. But gradually its dependence on electoral support caused it to broaden its appeal by a populist program, and its organisation moved from the trade unions to the electorate committee. So that despite its early successes, the United Labour Party's policy of gradual reform and concentration on the electoral contained the seeds of later discord in the labour movement. That is, conflict with the class interests of the workers who sought the complete emancipation of labour and the securing to it of the full results of its toil. These conflicts marked the evolution of the labour movement after Federation. Quite possibly that would have been the alternative. You see, it seems to me that a process or a system such as Wakefield's was bound to be the sort of thing that would develop, which developed for colonisation in South Australia and later on in New Zealand. And the problem of how to get rid of the surplus poor in England and how to get rid of surplus capital by establishing colonies was a matter that was of great concern for the British government. So they had to find some way of establishing these colonies. And I think we're looking at it in a perspective. You've got to say that the establishing of colonies by the Wakefield system or by any other system was beneficial to the further development of capitalism and a necessary process they had to go through. But that's not to say that it was easily accepted by the workers. And it was a source of conflict, class conflict, because after all, the society that was established here carried with it all of the problems that that class society had in England. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Some of the convicts who went home to England after they'd served their time, came back here again. I think just taking the latter point first, that because of the reasons I've given, because of the reason that I've given about the loss of some 18,000 male workers left South Australia and the shearers worked as a contract system and still do, of course. But particularly the miners and the influence of the miners, it gave them this idea that they were self-employed. So that it wasn't really until the 70s that the labour movement did start to really get itself organised. Late 60s and early 70s. About this, whether I have a disagreement with who? Who? Yeah, well, I think that I haven't read that stuff of Coleman, so I can't comment on that. Well, the problem that I've got here, of course, is that Barron's term of office took place after the colonial period, so I'm not sort of dealing with it here tonight. But he was, I think, for 10 years, the president of the Moondah Miners. He established a good position in the trade union movement among the Moondah miners and was pretty highly respected. His later development, I think, particularly during the period of the First World War, was not a very favourable one as far as the labour movement was concerned. And there would be plenty of people in that period that wouldn't be calling him honest because he was on the side of the conscriptionists. What are the words? Aborigines. Yes, I understand that there were Aborigines working there. There were also Aborigines working on the stations, of course, as they've done ever since. And there were also Aborigines that played some part in the harvesting of wheat crops. But the general concept of the early settlers was, or the people who planned South Australia, was that they were going to sort of mobilise the Aborigines to become Christians and join the workforce. Well, of course, they didn't do that, and their whole mode of life was different to most other sorts of colonies, such as, say, India, which had a developed economy of its own before the British came there, and an economy which many skills had developed. That wasn't the position of the Aborigines, and they, as a nomadic and purely hunting and food gathering people, they just didn't fit into the plans of Wakefield, either as landowners or as workers for the landowners. That was the general process. But of course, as time passed, more of them did begin to become involved in the labour movement, or not so much the labour movement, but in the workforce, both as I say on the stations, as working for the farmers, and also I understand in the mines. Yeah. I think if you took it overall, in Australia, the labour shortage was the main reason why the conditions of Australian workers were fairly good by world standards, or particularly compared with what they'd been in England. And this shortage of labour was mainly because Australia was a fairly rich new country in which industry and commerce and capital of all kinds was expanding, and so there was a continual demand for labour. But this problem in South Australia was somewhat exceptional, because it was based on agriculture, and some years there would be plentiful labour needed because of the sort of work or harvest, the seasonal conditions, In other periods, if you had a year or two of drought, there was no demand for it at all. So that fluctuation of the economy was most marked here. And then secondly, with the Wakefield scheme and the importation of labour by the government paying out a sum of money every year to bring them in, it caused a surplus. And generally speaking, in any agricultural community or a state with agriculture as the base, the tendency is for standards of wages to be lower than the general norm, and that was the position in this state with the Wakefield scheme and the agricultural base. The Byners used to hold meetings and generally start them off with a hymn or have a few prayers in the course of it. The question of religion and of their pastors were very closely interlinked with their whole life. And in the Borough strike, they held a religious service on the hillside while their leaders were negotiating with the mine owners. But I don't think that is the question so much, just because they were interested in religion or followed religion, but the whole tradition of the Cornish miners themselves, which didn't have, as the primitive Methodist ideas, which were much more militant. They used to have, the primitive Methodists used to have what they call camp meetings, which are great gatherings of followers of the religion, and immediately after the rise and development of primitive Methodism and the Chartism which followed, the camp meetings were transferred to the Chartists. They carried on the camp meetings of the primitive Methodists, so that there was a great deal of fine oratory and agitation that was carried on at both the primitive Methodist meetings and also at the Chartist meetings, which was a different sort of an outlet. I mean, if you take the position of Gilmore, who I think is a very interesting character in South Australian history, he was only here for 2 years. He came from the north of England. He was in South Australia from 1899 to 91 when he died. He was an ill man when he came here. He'd been brought up in the north of England in a very poor part and was a primitive Methodist preacher in the north of England. When he came here, he immediately hopped into the Labour movement, and his church at North Adelaide had to have extensions made to it to accommodate the crowds of people that used to go and listen to him. And when he died, one of the biggest funerals ever to take place in South Australia up to that date took place, with large numbers of the workers and the Trades and Labour Council officials and so on participating in the funeral. He was held in very great regard. And I was reading an article about the village settlement on the Murray, one of the village settlements, and the girl writing this said that his sermons were used at their Sunday observances years after he had died. But he was a primitive Methodist, and his concept of Christian socialism, if you like, was more pronounced or more militant than the sort of religion that the Cornish miners at Burra or Wallaroo and Moonta followed. Well, in 1887, particularly in the dispute in 1887, there was a considerable development of the ideas of arbitration, and it had developed also in the intercolonial trade union movement. There was a move immediately after the 1887 dispute for a form of arbitration to take place between the seamen and the employers. People who rejected it were the employers, because they were facing more difficult times and they were worried about the competition of interstate shipping companies. But what was proposed then was that an agreement should be made for 12 months and then reviewed again in another year's time. But it was put up and supported by the unions. I don't think that really in that period at all, and with Kingston's proposals, and probably for a fair while afterwards, there was any view that the state was anything but an independent body, which of course it's not. Well, my thoughts about this, I mentioned there in that dispute around the Masters and Servants Act that some German workers were involved, and in a good way, in opposition to the amendments to the Masters and Servants Act of that meeting at the Hamburg Hotel. But I think that the tendency was, and I think that this is maybe not well thought out, and Ian probably knows more about this than I do, but I think that generally there was an insularity about the Germans in their settlements and their language and their customs and their church tended to separate them from the community as a whole. Although, with the formation of the Labour Party, the German Club was certainly one of those original organisations that helped to form the Labour Party. So there was at least a section of them that was interested. But then, of course, a lot of Germans too were connected with the land, perhaps more than being connected with the industrial movement. So perhaps they were not so involved, although some were. Oh, well, I don't know about them as a sort of separate movement from their members or their workers being active in the general labour movement, but there were certainly quite a few Irish involved in the early labour movement. Origin of the Tanners Union was one, who became a member of Parliament later on, and he was involved in the 1890 strike. They had quite a big Tanners strike in that early part of 1890. But I haven't sort of picked them out as a sort of separate grouping. I think that they were probably involved with the other workers. Oh yes, well of course that was certainly so in the post-war period with the rise of the industrial groups and that sort of thing. But I think that that was a deliberate policy pursued by the church. That is, that it would make the Labour Party and the Labour movement a base for itself. And I think that there were, particularly in the eastern states, large numbers of Catholic workers who found in the Labour Party the most radical of the parties and the most national of the parties, because they were interested in Irish nationalism, and the whole question of nationalism followed on from that. But because South Australia was mainly a Methodist state, particularly as far as the mass of the workers were concerned, in the early period the Catholic influence was not as strong as it was in the Labour Party, say in Victoria and New South Wales. I mean, even among many of the early convicts there were radical Irish who'd been sent out for their agitation and opposition to Britain in Ireland, and were included in some of the early convicts. Well, they provided a radical leavening for the position. I mean, if you take Peter Layla, for instance, at the Eureka Stockade was an Irishman, and there were quite a number of Irishmen involved in that period. The Irish influence in the Labour movement, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, was quite large, but here not so much because of this Methodist influence. Yes, yes, I think that I mentioned that quite early the women of the miners at Moonta and Wallaroo were very active in support of their menfolk whenever they were involved in disputes. And you might remember there's a story about that Oswald Pryor makes in his book about how the women swept the men that were still working in sections of the mine out of the mine workings with their brooms. They were organised by the strike committee. And Spence, W.G. Spence, the pioneer trade union leader who formed the miners' union in Australia and also the shearers, later became the AWU, he was up at Moonta on one occasion to address a meeting about a proposed strike, and he saw the women already there armed with their brooms if the men happened to go on strike, and he commented about how interested they were in the decisions made by the men. So in that area, at any rate, they were closely connected. But then It wasn't until the women themselves started to become workers, that is, involved in industry, domestic servants, of course, are much more isolated one from the other. It's not the same possibility of organisation in single women here and there working for private households. When they get together, that there's a chance to get organised, and when they became members of the workforce by joining particularly the clothing industry, the first movement that started there was in opposition to sweating, as I mentioned, and the trade union movement helped them to form the Working Women's Trade Union, and in 1890 they sent their first delegates along to the Trades and Labour Council, and there for an early part of the formation of this union, different men were the secretaries or presidents, but after a period the women took over from them. I'm not going to try and justify all of the sort of weaknesses of the labour movement in connection with the women's movement. I'm just mentioning those small facts. I haven't been able to detect the sort of differences that some people seem to find between these two sections. Now, the new unionism, that is the involvement of large numbers of unskilled workers, developed quite early here, if you say compare it with some other places, particularly England, where trade unionism was based almost solely on the trades at the beginning. And it wasn't until about 1889 in the dockers' strike that Tom Mann and Burns and these other people helped to develop the ideas of the new unionism, of everyone in the industry belonging to the union. But the seamen and the waterside workers here had commenced such an organisation in 1872 in South Australia. And there was as it were, a close affinity between the unions of the new union type, that is the mass unions, and the trade unions. That there was not the large separation, according to what I can see here, that some people seem to imagine. And certainly that was the situation, as I mentioned, for example, that the seamen, represented by Morris, he was the president of the Trades and Labour Council in 1886 when the Australian Congress was held here, and he became the first secretary of the Maritime Labour Council at Port Adelaide, which included a number of unskilled workers' unions and skilled workers' unions. And I don't think that there was that big a difference between them. When the Trades and Labour Council was formed, they were all in it together, so that's why it was called Trades, a council for the trades, and the labour organisation, two united in the Trades and Labour Council. Oh no, the papers, first of all, this Labour Advocate, and then our Commonwealth that the Trades and Labour Council adopted as part of the paper in 1888. They didn't last very long. Our Commonwealth only went for a couple of years, or less than a couple of years. And it wasn't until the Labour Party's Herald started that a Labour paper became more firmly established. And I think it was during Barron's period of office that the Labour Herald became a daily paper in South Australia. So the significance of a Labour press was certainly seen. And that continued from that period right up until the 20s. Yes, well, this is one of the main demands of the Labour. What is it? The Labour. What was the one that developed the Labour Advocate? The Labour League, and this was on their program for recognition of the unions. And as I mentioned, at one time it had, I think, in 1876, it had 13 unions affiliated to it, and they certainly agitated for recognition as bodies able to negotiate and have their own funds and all of these sort of things that the government, Coburn government, I think, passed legislation recognising. But more than that I can tell you. The AWU, when it was formed, had a clause in it excluding Asian members. But that had arisen. See, I think that the White Australia policy and the racial attitudes of Australian workers was a thing that developed over the years, but it was initiated by the employers. I mean, they wanted a source of cheap labour, and that was what Baggett's scheme was all about in that Masters and Servants Act. So that the initiation of the whole idea of cheap labour by the employers developed a resistance by the workers, naturally. And that sort of developed then into the scheme of excluding coloured labour. In this state, particularly with the annexation of the Northern Territory in the 60s, there was a widespread agitation by employers and governments that labour from Ceylon and China should be used in the Northern Territory because the conditions there were thought not to be good for white workers. They bring in the coloured workers and pay them less money, and as a matter of fact, at some of the mines in the Northern Territory they use Chinese and Ceylonese workers. But the unions, instead of finding a way maybe of organising the Chinese and other workers and helping them to fight for conditions equal to the Australian workers, tended to see the matter purely on racial grounds and to exclude them. And that clause was included in the AWU rules and constitution that no Asians could be members. Yeah, that added to it. That was, you might say, one of the highlight periods of the anti-racial attitudes of the Australian workers, but it had already begun before that, as I said, like with that scheme of Baggett's in the 1840s to bring Chinese and other cheap sources of cheap labour. As one of the participants said, they tried to establish communism without communists.